I sat in my beat-up Honda outside the iron gates, checking the address one more time against the crumpled job posting in my hand. The numbers matched, but this couldn't be right. The mansion beyond the gates looked like something from a movie. 3 stories of weathered stone and towering windows, surrounded by overgrown gardens that probably hadn't seen proper care in decades. My phone buzzed with another text from Mom asking if I'd heard back about any jobs yet. The rent notice taped to our apartment door this morning had given us 2 weeks. 2 weeks to come up with $800 we didn't have, or my little sister would be sleeping in the car again. The intercom crackled when I pressed the button. "James Martinez for the interview," I said. The gates swung open without a response. I drove up the winding gravel path, my car's engine sounding pathetic against the silence of the place. No traffic noise reached here. No neighbors, just trees pressing in from all sides. The job posting had mentioned isolated property, but this felt like stepping into another world entirely. The woman who answered the front door matched the voice from our brief phone conversation, elderly but sharp, with silver hair pulled back severely and eyes that seemed to take in everything about me in one sweep. She wore an expensive-looking black dress that belonged in a much fancier place than anywhere I'd ever worked. "Ms. Hunter, you're punctual. Come in." She led me through an entrance hall that could have fit my entire apartment. My work boots echoed against marble floors, and I found myself walking more carefully to muffle the sound. Everything looked expensive and old, the kind of old that meant valuable, not worn out. "You mentioned on the phone that you have experience with general maintenance," she said, not looking back as we walked. "Yes, ma'am. Mostly apartment buildings and small offices, but I'm good with repairs, cleaning, basic electrical work, whatever needs doing." We passed doorways leading to rooms I couldn't see into, but I caught glimpses of covered furniture and more of that heavy, expensive-looking stuff. The whole place felt like a museum where someone had forgotten to turn on all the lights. "The position involves maintaining this entire property," Ms. Hunter said, stopping in what looked like a formal sitting room. "Cleaning, minor repairs, groundskeeping, general upkeep. The work isn't difficult, but it requires attention to detail and absolute reliability." She gestured for me to sit in a leather chair that probably cost more than my car. I perched on the edge, trying not to look as out of place as I felt. "The pay is $1,500 per week." I nearly choked. "$1,500? Is that acceptable?" "Yes, ma'am. That's more than acceptable." I couldn't hide the relief in my voice. $1,500 a week would solve everything. Rent, groceries, maybe even enough left over to fix the air conditioning before summer hit. Ms. Hunter sat across from me, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "The compensation reflects the unique requirements of this position. You would be expected to stay overnight when necessary, sometimes for several days at a time. The property requires constant attention." "That's fine. Whatever you need." "There are also specific protocols you must follow. These aren't suggestions or preferences. They're absolute requirements for your safety and the proper maintenance of this property." Something in her tone made me pay closer attention. She pulled a typed sheet of paper from a side table and handed it to me. "Read this carefully." The rules were printed in the same formal font as a legal document. 1. Never enter any locked room on the second floor under any circumstances. 2. Avoid looking directly at the painting in the main hallway. 3. Never consume any food or beverages left on the dining room table. 4. Do not approach the pool area after sunset. 5. Always knock and wait for permission before entering any room, even if you believe it to be empty. I read through the list twice, waiting for some kind of explanation that would make them seem normal. None came. "These are pretty specific. They exist for your protection, not my convenience," Ms. Hunter said. The previous worker disregarded several of these guidelines. His employment ended abruptly. The way she said "ended abruptly" made my stomach tighten, but I needed this job too badly to ask questions. Weird rules were better than no paycheck. I understand. I'll follow them exactly. She studied my face for a long moment, those sharp eyes searching for something. You live with family? My mom and younger sister. They depend on you financially? Yes, ma'am. She nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already suspected. The work begins immediately. I'll show you the areas you'll be responsible for. Then I have business elsewhere that will keep me away until tomorrow evening. Ms. Hunter led me through the main floor, pointing out rooms and explaining basic maintenance schedules. The dining room contained a long wooden table that looked like it could seat 20 people. The kitchen belonged in a restaurant, all stainless steel and commercial-grade appliances. Every room felt too quiet, like the house was holding its breath. When we reached the main hallway, I automatically glanced toward the painting she'd mentioned in the rules. It hung in an ornate frame near the staircase. A portrait of a man in old-fashioned clothing with hollow, empty eyes that seemed to follow my movement even when I tried not to look directly at it. "Remember what I told you about that painting?" Ms. Hunter said, noticing my glance. "Don't look at it directly. Got it." We climbed to the second floor, where she showed me a supply closet and a small room with a bed and basic furniture. "You can stay here when overnight work is required. This door leads to the bathroom you'll use." She handed me a ring of keys. "These open the rooms you're authorized to enter. The locked rooms remain off limits." I could see 3 doors down the hallway with different locks, older and heavier than the standard doorknobs elsewhere in the house. "What's in those rooms?" "Nothing that concerns you." Her tone cut off any follow-up questions. Back downstairs, she showed me where the cleaning supplies were stored and handed me a basic schedule of daily tasks. Everything seemed straightforward except for those rules, which kept nagging at the back of my mind. "I'll return tomorrow evening to check on your progress," she said, collecting a small black purse from the sitting room. "Remember, follow the guidelines precisely. They aren't arbitrary." "Yes, ma'am, I'll be careful." She paused at the front door, studying me one more time with those penetrating eyes. "Your family is fortunate to have someone willing to work so hard for them." Something about the way she said it made me uncomfortable, but before I could respond, she was walking toward a black sedan parked near the garage. I watched from the doorway as she drove away, her car disappearing beyond the gates and leaving me completely alone with the silent house. I stood there for a few minutes, taking in the reality of the situation. $1,500 a week for housekeeping and maintenance. Rules that made no sense but weren't really my business anyway. A house that felt more like a museum than someone's home. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Mom asking how the interview went. I typed back that I got the job and would explain everything later. The relief in her response made everything else seem worth it. I walked back through the main hall, past that painting I wasn't supposed to look at, and collected the cleaning supplies from the kitchen. The sooner I got started, the sooner I could prove I was worth that impossible salary. The house remained perfectly quiet as I began my first day of work, room by room, following every rule exactly as instructed. I finished wiping down the last of the kitchen counters and checked my watch. 7:30. The house felt different, now that darkness was settling outside the windows, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly how. Maybe it was just the way my footsteps echoed differently in the larger rooms, or how the shadows seemed deeper in the corners. The cleaning had gone smoothly enough. Every room I'd been given access to was now dusted, vacuumed, and organized according to the schedule Ms. Hunter had left me. My muscles ached in that familiar way that came from a full day of physical work, but it was a good ache, the kind that meant I'd earned my keep. I was putting the vacuum back in the supply closet when my stomach growled loud enough to echo off the walls. I'd been so focused on making a good impression that I'd completely forgotten to eat anything since the gas station coffee and stale donut I'd grabbed on the way to the interview that morning. Walking back through the main hallway toward the kitchen to see what food I might have brought with me, I stopped dead in my tracks. The dining room table, which had been empty when I'd dusted it earlier, now held what looked like a complete dinner spread. Roasted chicken that was still steaming, roasted vegetables that looked like they'd just come out of the oven, and an elaborate chocolate cake with decorative frosting swirls that belonged in a fancy bakery window. The smell hit me next, rich and savory and making my mouth water instantly. Everything looked perfect, like it had been professionally prepared and set out just moments ago. But that was impossible. I'd been alone in this house for hours, and I would have heard someone cooking or moving around in the kitchen. I stood there staring at the food, my stomach cramping with hunger, when Ms. Hunter's voice echoed in my memory. Never consume any food or beverages left on the dining room table. Not ask permission first or only on special occasions. Never. The chicken looked incredible. The vegetables were arranged like something from a restaurant. That cake probably cost more than I usually spent on groceries in a week. But I forced myself to back away from the table and head to the kitchen instead. My own food situation was pretty grim. A protein bar I'd forgotten in my jacket pocket and a half-empty bottle of water from the car. I ate the protein bar standing at the kitchen counter, trying not to think about the feast sitting 20 feet away in the dining room. After I finished eating, I decided to organize the cleaning supplies more efficiently for tomorrow's work. The supply closet was decent-sized, but everything had been shoved in haphazardly. I started pulling out boxes of rags, bottles of cleaning solution, and various tools to sort them properly. One of the boxes was heavier than I expected and balanced weird in my hands. As I lifted it down from a high shelf, it slipped and crashed to the floor, spilling cleaning rags and spare light bulbs across the closet and out into the main hallway. "Damn it," I muttered, dropping to my knees to gather everything up. I was collecting scattered light bulbs when I looked up to check how far they'd rolled. That's when my eyes landed squarely on the painting hanging near the staircase. The man in the portrait was staring directly at me, not just in my general direction the way portraits sometimes seem to track movement, but locked on my eyes specifically. His hollow gaze felt like it was boring into me, and his mouth looked like it was curved in the faintest suggestion of a smile. Cold shot down my spine and I yanked my eyes away, my hands shaking as I scrambled to collect the rest of the spilled supplies. I shoved everything back into the box without bothering to organize it and shut the closet door harder than necessary. Don't look directly at the painting. Such a simple rule, and I'd already broken it twice in 2 days, but the way that painted face had seemed so focused on me. I shook my head and headed toward the kitchen for another drink of water, anything to get the image out of my mind. It was almost 10 when I decided to do a final walkthrough of the house before settling in for the night. Ms. Hunter had mentioned closing windows as part of the evening routine, and I wanted to make sure everything was secure. Most of the windows on the main floor were already closed, but when I got to the sunroom that overlooked the pool area, I found 3 of them still open. The night air coming through was cooler than I expected, carrying the faint scent of chlorine and something else I couldn't identify. I was reaching for the latch on the middle window when movement in the pool caught my eye. Something dark was moving beneath the surface of the water. At first I thought it might be some kind of pool cleaning device, but the shape was wrong for that. It moved too smoothly, too deliberately, almost like it was swimming. I leaned closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The pool lights were on, casting that artificial blue glow through the water, but whatever was down there seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. It was roughly the size and shape of a person, but it moved in a way that made my skin crawl. Every time I tried to focus on it directly, though, it would shift position or fade somehow, like it was deliberately avoiding my direct attention. I found myself moving my head left and right, trying to catch it in my peripheral vision where it seemed clearer. Then it stopped moving entirely, and I couldn't see it anymore. I stood there for another 5 minutes, scanning the bottom of the pool, but whatever had been down there was gone. Maybe it had never been there at all. Pool lights could create weird shadows, especially when you were tired and your mind was playing tricks on you. I closed the remaining windows and locked them, then headed back through the house toward my room. Passing through the dining room, I glanced at the table again. The food looked exactly as fresh and appealing as it had 3 hours ago. The chicken should have been cold and congealed by now, the vegetables wrinkled, the cake starting to dry out. Instead, everything looked like it had just been plated. That was when I really started to feel uneasy. I climbed the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps sounding too loud in the silence. The hallway stretched out in both directions from the landing, my assigned room at one end, and those locked doors Ms. Hunter had forbidden me from approaching at the other. I walked quickly to my room without looking toward the locked doors, though I could feel their presence behind me like something watching. The room Ms. Hunter had given me was basic but comfortable. Single bed, small dresser, a chair by the window. I'd left my overnight bag on the bed that morning, and now I unpacked my few belongings and tried to settle in for the night. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I started to drift off, I'd hear something in the hallway outside my door. Soft sounds, like someone walking very carefully, trying not to make noise. The footsteps seemed to pause right outside my room for long stretches, then continue down the hall toward the locked rooms. I lay there staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was just the house settling, old pipes expanding and contracting, normal sounds that seemed louder in the silence. Houses this old probably made all kinds of noise at night, but the sounds were too regular, too purposeful, and they only seemed to happen when I was just about to fall asleep, like something was deliberately trying to keep me awake. Around midnight, the footsteps stopped entirely and the house fell into complete silence. That should have been a relief, but somehow the total quiet was even worse than the mysterious sounds had been. I pulled the covers up to my chin and forced my eyes closed, trying to focus on the $1,500 a week that would solve all my family's problems. Whatever weird things were happening in this house, I could handle them for that kind of money. I just had to follow the rules, do my job, and not let my imagination run wild. But as I finally started to drift off, I could swear I heard the faint sound of someone moving around downstairs in the dining room. My body ached as I pulled myself out of bed, every muscle protesting from the combination of physical work and tension from lying rigid most of the night. The sounds in the hallway had eventually stopped, but I'd barely managed a few hours of actual sleep before my internal clock kicked in around 7. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, my stomach already growling despite the protein bar I'd forced down the night before. The house felt different in the morning, less oppressive somehow, though I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was just the way my footsteps didn't echo quite as much, or how the rooms seemed less cavernous when I wasn't thinking about what might be moving around in them. Walking through the main hallway, I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, not even glancing toward the painting. Whatever tricks my tired mind had played on me yesterday, I wasn't giving it another chance to mess with my head. But when I reached the dining room, I stopped dead in my tracks. The elaborate dinner spread from the night before had vanished completely. In its place sat what looked like a perfect breakfast, a stack of fluffy pancakes with butter melting down the sides, a bowl of fresh fruit that looked like it had just been cut, and a steaming mug of coffee that I could smell from the doorway. Everything was arranged on the same china plates, but the food was completely different. I stood there staring at the setup, my mind racing through the possibilities. Someone had to have been in this house. Someone had cleared away last night's meal and prepared this new one, but every door and window I'd checked before bed had been locked, and I would have heard someone moving around in the kitchen. The coffee smelled incredible, rich and dark, the kind that probably cost more per pound than I usually spent on groceries. The pancakes looked like they belonged in a restaurant, perfectly golden and still warm enough that I could see a faint steam rising from them. Never consume any food or beverages left on the dining room table. I backed away from the tempting spread and headed to the kitchen, where my sad collection of protein bars and bottled water waited. But as I chewed through another cardboard-flavored bar, I couldn't stop thinking about how that coffee had smelled, or how perfectly prepared everything had looked. After I finished my meager breakfast, I grabbed the cleaning supplies and decided to tackle the second floor more thoroughly than I had the previous day. I'd been so focused on following Ms. Hunter's rules and making a good impression that I hadn't really paid attention to the details of the house itself. The hallway upstairs felt longer in the morning, stretching out in both directions from the staircase. My assigned room and bathroom were at one end, the supply closet in the middle, and those 3 locked doors at the far end. I started with the supply closet, reorganizing everything I'd hastily shoved back in the night before. Working my way down the hall, I dusted the windowsills and picture frames, cleaned the bathroom again even though it barely needed it, and straightened up my temporary bedroom. The whole time I found myself glancing toward those locked doors. Ms. Hunter had been very clear about not approaching them, but from this distance they just looked like regular doors. Heavy wood, older style handles, nothing obviously threatening about them. I was dusting a small table near the staircase when I noticed something that made me freeze. The middle door, the one with the heaviest lock, was slightly open. Just a crack, maybe an inch, but definitely not closed tight like it had been yesterday. I stood there holding my dust rag, staring at that gap. Ms. Hunter had been very specific about those rooms being off limits. She'd given me keys only to the areas I was supposed to access, but the door was open now, and I hadn't touched it. The smart thing to do would be to close it and pretend I hadn't noticed, follow the rules, keep my head down, collect my $1,500 a week, and keep my family housed. But the curiosity was eating at me. What was behind that door that was so important to keep hidden? What could possibly be dangerous enough to warrant such strict warnings? I walked slowly down the hallway, my footsteps muffled by the old carpet runner. The gap in the door seemed to get wider as I approached, though I knew that was just my imagination. When I reached it, I stopped and listened carefully for any sounds from inside. Nothing. Complete silence. I leaned closer and peered through the crack. The room beyond looked like it belonged in a completely different house. Where everything else in the mansion was formal and expensive, this was clearly a child's bedroom, a small bed with a white metal frame, a dresser painted in pale yellow, stuffed animals arranged on a bookshelf. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that suggested it hadn't been touched in years. Everything except the bed. The covers were rumpled and pushed back, like someone had recently gotten up from sleeping there. The pillow still held the impression of a head, and the sheets looked relatively clean compared to the dust coating every other surface in the room. My heart started beating faster as I stared at that unmistakably used bed in the middle of an otherwise abandoned room. A child's room that was supposed to be locked and off limits, but somehow contained evidence that someone had been sleeping there recently. I pushed the door open just a little wider, trying to get a better look. The stuffed animals on the shelf looked old and worn, the kind that had been loved and played with for years before being forgotten. Books were scattered across a small desk, children's stories with bright covers that had faded with age. But that bed, someone had definitely been in it, recently. I pulled the door back to its original position and stepped away, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the dust rag. Whatever was going on in that room, it wasn't something I was supposed to see. Ms. Hunter's warnings echoed in my head, her emphasis on following the rules for my own protection. I finished the second floor quickly after that, not looking toward the locked doors again. My focus stayed on the basic cleaning tasks, dusting and organizing and trying not to think about recently slept-in beds in supposedly abandoned rooms. Around noon, I decided to tackle the outdoor work. The weather was decent, and I figured some fresh air might help clear my head. I'd noticed yesterday that the pool area had several pieces of deck furniture that could use cleaning, and Ms. Hunter's schedule included basic maintenance of the outdoor spaces. The pool deck was larger than it had looked from the house, with several lounge chairs and a glass-topped table arranged around the water. Everything was expensive looking but showed signs of neglect, like it had been set up and then forgotten about. I started wiping down the chairs, working my way around the pool's perimeter. The water looked normal in the daylight. Clear blue, properly chlorinated with the standard pool equipment humming quietly at the far end. No signs of anything unusual moving beneath the surface. I was cleaning the glass table when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Something dark was moving underwater again, roughly in the center of the pool. I looked directly at it this time, not trying to avoid it or convince myself I was imagining things. The shape was definitely there. Human-sized, moving with purpose rather than drifting randomly. It seemed to be swimming in deliberate patterns, following the same route around the pool's bottom over and over again. But it wasn't reflecting the light the way a person would. Instead, it looked like an area of concentrated darkness moving through the blue water. I watched it for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape never came close to the surface, never showed any recognizable human features, just continued its systematic movement along the bottom of the pool. Grabbing a long-handled pool net from the equipment area, I decided to investigate. If this was some kind of pool cleaning device or debris that had gotten stuck in a current, I could fish it out and solve the mystery once and for all. I lowered the net into the water, aiming for where the dark shape was moving. The moment the net broke the surface, the shape stopped moving entirely, and then simply vanished. Not like it had swum away quickly, but like it had never been there at all. I moved the net around the area where I'd been watching it, feeling for anything solid on the pool bottom. Nothing. Just smooth concrete and the normal suction from the pool's filtration system. I pulled the net out and stared at the empty water, feeling more unsettled than ever. Whatever I'd been watching, it wasn't debris or equipment malfunction. It was something else entirely, something that could disappear the moment I tried to interact with it. The afternoon passed quietly after that. I finished the outdoor cleaning tasks and moved back inside to work on the main floor. The house felt normal enough during the daylight hours, just an old mansion with expensive furniture and odd rules. But the memory of that used bed in the locked room and the vanishing shape in the pool kept nagging at me. I was organizing supplies in the kitchen when I happened to glance out the window toward the pool deck. That's when I saw them. Muddy footprints leading from the pool's edge to the back door of the house. Wet, clearly defined prints that definitely hadn't been there when I'd finished working outside an hour earlier. They looked like they'd been made by bare feet, and they were still damp enough to be clearly visible against the light-colored concrete. I stared at those prints through the kitchen window, my stomach sinking. Someone had gotten out of that pool and walked to the house. Someone who'd been in the water while I was inside cleaning, leaving behind evidence of their presence that I couldn't explain away or rationalize. The footprints ended at the back door, but when I checked the lock, it was still secure. No signs of forced entry. No indication that anyone had actually entered the house. Just those wet prints leading right up to the door and stopping. I grabbed paper towels and went outside to clean up the prints, not wanting to leave any evidence of whatever had happened. But as I knelt down to wipe them away, I realized they weren't just random footprints. They were perfectly formed, with clear impressions of toes and heel, the kind of prints that only came from someone walking deliberately and carefully. Someone who had climbed out of that pool and walked directly to the house in the middle of the afternoon while I was inside working just a few rooms away. The wet footprints stayed with me for the rest of the afternoon. Even after I'd scrubbed them away with paper towels and watched the concrete dry completely, I kept glancing out the kitchen window to make sure they hadn't reappeared. Every few minutes I'd catch myself checking, like my brain refused to accept that I'd actually cleaned them up. I tried to focus on my remaining tasks for the day. The work schedule Ms. Hunter had left was detailed enough to keep me busy from morning until evening, and staying focused on normal maintenance felt like the only way to keep my mind from spiraling into panic about beds that had been slept in and shapes that vanished when I tried to touch them. By the time evening started creeping in through the windows, I'd managed to work my way through most of the list. The last item was replacing burned-out light bulbs throughout the house, something I'd noticed during my cleaning but hadn't gotten around to addressing yet. I collected the spare bulbs from the supply closet and a small stepladder, then started with the main hallway since it had the most burned-out fixtures, Standing on the ladder, unscrewing the old bulbs and testing the new ones, felt reassuringly normal. Physical work with tangible results, the kind of simple problem-solving that made sense. I was working on the third fixture when I glanced down to check my position on the ladder. That's when my eyes landed directly on the painting again. The man's hollow eyes were looking straight at me, tracking my movement as I shifted my weight on the ladder. His mouth had curved into what was definitely a smile now, not the neutral expression I'd seen before. The change was subtle but unmistakable, like he was pleased about something. I forced myself to look away and focus on the light bulb in my hands, but my fingers were shaking enough that I nearly dropped it. Just a painting, I told myself. Old portraits always seem to watch you move around a room. It was a common optical illusion, nothing more. But when I glanced back a few minutes later while moving the ladder to the next fixture, I could swear the man's hand position had changed. Previously, both hands had been resting on the arms of his chair. Now, his left hand appeared to be pointing slightly toward the staircase, index finger extended in a subtle gesture that definitely hadn't been there before. I climbed down from the ladder and backed away from the painting, my heart beating fast enough that I could hear it in my ears. Paintings didn't change positions. People didn't move around inside frames. There had to be some logical explanation for what I was seeing. Maybe the lighting was different now that I'd replaced some of the bulbs. Maybe the shadows were falling differently across the painted surface, creating an illusion of movement. Maybe I was just tired and stressed, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I finished replacing the light bulbs as quickly as possible, keeping my eyes fixed on the fixtures and never looking toward the painting again. When I was done, I gathered up the stepladder and burned out bulbs and headed straight for the garage to put everything away. The garage was attached to the house but felt completely separate from the mansion's oppressive atmosphere, more like a normal workspace with concrete floors and metal shelving and the smell of motor oil and old tools. I was organizing the cleaning supplies when I heard footsteps on the gravel driveway outside. Relief flooded through me. Ms. Hunter was back early from her business trip. I could tell her about the weird things that had been happening, get some rational explanations, maybe even ask if she'd hired someone else to help with the property maintenance. That would explain the footprints and the sounds in the hallway at night. I walked out of the garage toward the front of the house, ready to greet her and help carry in any luggage, but the driveway was empty. No car, no person, nothing but the sound of my own footsteps on the gravel. I stood there looking around, confused. I definitely heard someone walking. Clear, deliberate footsteps crunching on the small stones, coming from the direction of the road toward the house. The kind of sound that only came from someone walking with purpose, not random settling or wind-blown debris. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh impressions in the gravel led from the road up the driveway toward the front door. Normal-sized shoe prints, spaced evenly like someone had walked up to the house at a steady pace. But they stopped abruptly about 10 feet from the front door, right in the middle of the driveway. No prints leading away, no signs that whoever had made them had turned around or stepped off the gravel onto the grass. They just ended. I followed the trail from the road to where it stopped, trying to make sense of what I was looking at. The prints were clear and recent, pressed into the loose gravel with enough weight to leave distinct impressions, but they led nowhere. Someone had walked halfway up the driveway and then simply vanished. I checked all the windows and doors, making sure the house was still secure. Everything was locked exactly as I'd left it. No signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had actually reached the building. Just those impossible footprints that ended in empty space. The smart thing would be to go back inside and pretend I hadn't seen anything. Add it to the growing list of weird occurrences that probably had rational explanations I just wasn't thinking of. But I found myself walking around the perimeter of the house anyway, checking for any other signs that someone had been on the property. The backyard was empty. The pool deck showed no new footprints beyond the ones I'd cleaned up earlier. The gardens and lawn areas looked undisturbed. Whatever had made those prints in the driveway hadn't left any other trace of their presence. As darkness settled over the property, I decided to finish the last few tasks on my schedule. The windows throughout the house needed checking and locking for the night, something Ms. Hunter had emphasized as part of the evening routine. I started with the main floor, working my way from room to room and making sure each window was properly secured. When I reached the sunroom overlooking the pool, I found myself moving more carefully than I had the night before. The memory of that dark shape moving underwater was still fresh in my mind, and I didn't want to spend another evening watching something I couldn't explain swimming in circles on the bottom of the pool. I was reaching for the latch on the middle window when I saw it, a tall, dark figure standing at the far end of the pool deck, not moving underwater this time, but standing upright on the concrete decking near the deep end of the pool, completely motionless, like a statue that had been placed there. But this wasn't a statue. It was the rough size and shape of a person, though something about its proportions seemed wrong in a way I couldn't pinpoint. The figure appeared to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even with the pool lights casting their blue glow across the deck, the area around the figure remained darker than it should have been, like it was creating its own shadow that extended in all directions. I pressed my face closer to the window, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move, didn't react to my presence at all. Just stood there facing the house, though I couldn't make out any facial features or specific details. It was like looking at a human-shaped hole cut out of the night. "Hey," I called out through the window. "Who's there?" My voice echoed off the glass, but received no response. The figure remained perfectly still, giving no indication that it had heard me or even cared that I was watching it. I fumbled for the switch that controlled the deck lighting, hoping that brighter illumination would reveal what I was actually looking at. Maybe it was just a trick of shadows and pool equipment, some combination of objects that created the illusion of a person standing there. The deck lights blazed on, flooding the pool area with harsh white light. The figure was gone. I stared at the empty deck, my hands pressed against the window glass. Nothing. No person, no equipment, no combination of shadows that could have created the shape I'd been looking at. Just the pool and the surrounding concrete, all clearly visible under the bright lights. I turned the lights off and on several more times, scanning every inch of the deck and the surrounding area. The figure didn't reappear. Whatever I'd seen had vanished the moment I'd tried to illuminate it properly. I locked the sunroom windows and backed away from the pool area, my mind racing through possible explanations. Someone playing pranks, maybe. A trespasser who'd run off when I turned on the lights. But the deck had no hiding places, nowhere for a person to go without being visible as they fled. The rest of the evening routine passed in a blur. I finished locking the remaining windows, checked all the doors twice, and tried to convince myself that everything I'd witnessed had reasonable explanations. Old houses made strange noises. Pool lights created optical illusions. Gravel driveways probably showed footprints from earlier in the day that I just hadn't noticed before. But as I climbed the stairs to my room on the second floor, I couldn't shake the image of that motionless figure standing by the pool. The way it had seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it, creating an area of deeper darkness in the middle of an illuminated space. I locked my bedroom door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall and trying to process everything that had happened over the past 2 days. The used bed in the locked room, the vanishing shape in the pool, the footprints that led nowhere, and now a figure that disappeared when exposed to light. Something genuinely dangerous was happening in this mansion. Something that went beyond weird coincidences or my imagination playing tricks on me. The rules Ms. Hunter had given me weren't just quirky preferences of an eccentric employer. They were warnings about real threats that lived in this house. I pulled the covers up to my chin and tried to convince myself that I could make it through one more night. Tomorrow I would figure out what to do next. Maybe call Ms. Hunter and quit over the phone. Maybe just pack up and leave without bothering to explain. But for now, I was trapped in this room until morning, listening to the old house settle around me and trying not to think about dark figures that stood motionless in the night, watching and waiting for something I didn't understand. I woke up groggy and disoriented, my neck stiff from sleeping in the same tense position all night. The covers were still pulled up under my chin, exactly how I'd positioned them before finally drifting off sometime after midnight. Pale morning light filtered through the small bedroom window, making everything look normal and ordinary again. My phone showed it was past 8, later than I'd planned to get up. The house felt quiet around me, no sounds of movement or settling that had kept me on edge the night before. I dressed quickly and headed downstairs, eager to get started on the day's work and push yesterday's weird incidents out of my mind. On the kitchen counter, I found a handwritten note that definitely hadn't been there when I'd locked up the night before. The paper was cream-colored and expensive-looking, the kind Ms. Hunter would use, and her sharp handwriting covered most of the page. James, I've been called away unexpectedly on urgent business. I will return in a few days. Continue following all rules precisely during my absence. Someone may stop by to check on the property while I'm gone. Maintain your vigilance. Ms. Hunter. I read the note twice, trying to decide if this made me feel better or worse about my situation. Better, because it meant I wouldn't have to explain the weird things I'd been seeing to an employer who'd probably think I was losing my mind. Worse, because it left me completely alone in this place for several more days with no backup plan if things got even stranger. The part about someone stopping by to check on the property made me curious. Maybe it would be a normal person who could offer some rational explanations for what I'd been experiencing, or at least someone I could talk to who wouldn't look at me like I was crazy for mentioning footprints that led nowhere and figures that vanished when exposed to light. I tucked the note into my pocket and headed toward the dining room, wondering what mysterious meal would be waiting for me this morning. The routine was becoming predictable, even if the specific food kept changing. But when I walked into the dining room, I stopped and stared. This wasn't breakfast or even a meal for one person. The long table held an elaborate dinner spread that looked like it could feed 6 or 8 people. Multiple serving dishes filled with what appeared to be roasted meats and vegetables, several different types of bread, 3 different desserts arranged on separate platters. Everything was steaming hot and perfectly presented, as if a catering company had just finished setting up for a dinner party. The smell was incredible. Rich and savory, the kind of complex aromas that only came from hours of careful preparation. My stomach cramped with hunger as I stood there looking at enough food to feed my family for a week, all of it forbidden by the one rule I absolutely could not break. I forced myself to turn away and head back to the kitchen for another protein bar. The contrast between what I was allowed to eat and what was being offered felt deliberate now, like someone was testing my resolve or trying to wear down my willpower through constant temptation. While I chewed through the flavorless bar, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. One of the kitchen drawers was slightly open, the one where I'd organized the utensils the day before. I was certain I'd closed it properly after finishing my work, but now it hung open about an inch. I pulled the drawer out to check if anything was missing or disturbed. That's when I saw the mouse. A small gray field mouse lay curled up in the corner of the drawer, next to the measuring spoons. It was definitely dead, positioned on its side with its legs tucked under its body like it had died peacefully in its sleep. But something was wrong with its appearance. The mouse was completely drained of color, like someone had bleached it. Not white exactly, but a pale, washed-out gray that made it look more like a faded photograph than an actual animal. I grabbed paper towels and carefully lifted the mouse out of the drawer. Its body felt normal, the right weight and texture, but the lack of color was deeply unsettling. This wasn't how mice normally looked when they died. Even old, dried-out carcasses retained some of their natural coloring. After wrapping the mouse in several layers of paper towels, I carried it outside and disposed of it in the garbage bin near the garage. The whole time I kept trying to think of rational explanations. Maybe it was some kind of albino mouse. Maybe exposure to cleaning chemicals had affected its appearance. Maybe it was just the kitchen lighting making it look stranger than it actually was. But when I returned to the house and found another identical mouse in the sunroom, perfectly positioned in the center of a windowsill, I knew this wasn't a coincidence. This mouse looked exactly the same. Same size, same pale coloring, same peaceful positioning like it had just laid down to rest. It was placed deliberately on the sill, clearly visible to anyone walking through the room. Not hidden in a corner where a normal dead mouse might end up, but displayed prominently like someone wanted it to be found. I wrapped this one up and disposed of it as well, then spent the next hour searching the rest of the house. In the formal living room, I found the third mouse positioned on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. Same appearance, same deliberate placement, same unsettling sense that someone had arranged these discoveries specifically for me to find. Each mouse looked recently dead, not dried out or decomposed at all, but that drained, colorless appearance suggested something had happened to them beyond normal death, like whatever had killed them had somehow sucked the life out of them completely. I wrapped up the third mouse and threw it away with the others, then stood in the backyard trying to make sense of what I'd found. 3 identical dead mice, all positioned where I couldn't miss them, all showing the same strange lack of color. This wasn't a pest control issue or a random occurrence. Someone or something was leaving them for me to discover. When I walked back inside, I found myself unconsciously avoiding the main hallway where the painting hung. I'd been doing this all morning without really thinking about it, taking longer routes through the house to avoid passing directly in front of the portrait. But even when I wasn't looking at it, I could feel its presence, like someone standing behind me, watching everything I did. The feeling was strongest when I had to carry supplies from the kitchen to the second floor. The painting was positioned so that anyone climbing the stairs would pass directly in front of it, and every time I made that trip, the sensation of being watched intensified. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, but the awareness of those hollow painted eyes tracking my movement never went away. Around noon, I decided to check on the pool area. The dark shape had been more active yesterday, and I was curious if the pattern would continue. From the kitchen window, I could see the water clearly, and the shape was definitely there again. But this time, it wasn't just moving along the bottom. The dark form was swimming closer to the surface, sometimes breaking through enough to create ripples across the water, not fully emerging, never showing any recognizable features, but definitely interacting with the surface of the pool in a way it hadn't before. I watched it for several minutes, noting how the ripples spread outward from where the shape touched the surface. The movements looked purposeful, like whatever was down there was testing the boundary between water and air, getting ready for something. The idea of that thing eventually emerging from the pool sent a cold shock through me. I backed away from the window and focused on my afternoon cleaning tasks, trying not to think about what might be preparing to surface in the backyard. By 2 o'clock, I noticed something that made me question my own memory. The door to the supply closet upstairs was standing wide open, even though I was certain I'd closed it after getting my cleaning supplies that morning. I walked up to check it, pushing the door shut and making sure the latch caught properly. 20 minutes later, when I came back with a load of laundry, the door was open again. I closed it a second time, this time paying careful attention to how the latch worked and making sure it was completely secure. I even tested it by tugging on the door gently to confirm it was properly closed. An hour later, it was open again. I stood in the hallway staring at the open door, trying to figure out what was happening. The latch wasn't broken. The door wasn't warped or hanging crooked. Someone or something was opening it repeatedly, but I was the only person in the house. That's when I heard the voices. Soft whispered conversations coming from the direction of the locked rooms at the end of the hall. Not words I could make out clearly, but definitely the sound of multiple people talking quietly among themselves. The kind of hushed discussion you might hear at a funeral or in a library. I crept down the hallway toward the locked doors, trying to position myself where I could hear more clearly. The voices seemed to be coming from behind the middle door, the one with the child's bedroom that I'd glimpsed the day before. At least 2 different speakers, maybe 3, all talking in whispers, too quiet for me to understand. I pressed my ear against the door, straining to catch actual words. The conversation continued for several minutes, sometimes pausing and then resuming, like people taking turns speaking. But the voices were too muffled and distorted for me to make out anything specific. When I pulled my head back from the door, the hallway was completely silent again. No voices, no movement, nothing but the sound of my own breathing. I waited there for 10 more minutes, but the conversation didn't resume. Walking back toward the staircase, I noticed that the supply closet door was open again. I hadn't heard it open, hadn't seen any movement in the hallway, but somehow it had swung wide while I was listening at the locked room. I closed it once more and headed downstairs, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the banister. The isolation Ms. Hunter had mentioned in her note was starting to feel less like being alone, and more like being surrounded by things I couldn't see or understand. The afternoon stretched ahead of me with several more hours of cleaning tasks, and I found myself moving through the house more quickly than usual. Not running exactly, but walking with purpose, and trying not to linger in any room longer than necessary. The sensation of being watched had intensified throughout the day, and now it felt like multiple sets of eyes following my every movement. Whatever was happening in this mansion was escalating. The mice, the voices, the doors that wouldn't stay closed. It all felt like preparation for something bigger, like the house itself was getting ready to show me what it had been hiding behind all those careful rules and warnings. I just had to make it through a few more days until Ms. Hunter returned. Then I could quit and walk away from all of this. But as I went back to work, straightening and organizing rooms that felt increasingly hostile, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house had no intention of letting me leave. The afternoon heat made the hedge trimmers feel heavier in my hands than they should have. I'd been working on the overgrown bushes along the mansion's east side for about an hour, trying to lose myself in the simple mechanical work of cutting back branches that had grown wild over what looked like years of neglect. The repetitive motion helped quiet my mind after the morning's discoveries. Those pale, drained mice positioned like little warnings throughout the house. Each snip of the trimmers sent small branches tumbling to the ground around my feet. The bushes were thick and stubborn, some branches as thick as my thumb, and the work required enough focus that I could almost forget about whispered conversations coming from locked rooms. Almost. The property stretched much further back than I'd realized when I first arrived. Beyond the immediate lawn and garden areas, the grounds extended into what looked like several acres of woods. Tall trees created a natural barrier between the mansion and whatever lay beyond, their canopy thick enough to block most of the afternoon sun. I could hear birds calling from somewhere deep in those woods, the first normal wildlife sounds I'd encountered since starting this job. I was wrestling with a particularly stubborn branch near the corner of the house when I heard footsteps on the grass behind me. Not the sharp crunch of gravel like I'd heard in the driveway yesterday, but the soft sound of someone walking across the lawn. Relief flooded through me. Finally, the person Ms. Hunter had mentioned might stop by to check on the property. I turned around, expecting to see another maintenance worker or maybe a property manager. Instead, I found myself face to face with a man I'd never seen before, standing about 10 feet away near the edge of the garden area. He looked like he'd been walking for a long time, maybe even sleeping rough. His clothes were wrinkled and dirt-stained, his hair uncombed, and his face had the kind of exhaustion that went deeper than just being tired. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. They kept darting toward the mansion's windows, scanning them like he expected to see something looking back at him. Every few seconds, his gaze would jump from one window to another, never staying focused on me for more than a moment before checking the house again. "You're the new guy," he said. Not a question, just a statement delivered in a voice that sounded like he hadn't used it much recently. "Working for Ms. Hunter." I set down the hedge trimmers and wiped sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm. "Yeah, I'm James. Are you here to check on the property? Ms. Hunter left a note saying someone might come by." He shook his head, still glancing nervously at the windows. "Robert, I used to work here, a few years back." The way he said it made something cold settle in my stomach. Used to work here. Past tense, with a weight behind it that suggested the job hadn't ended well. I studied his face more carefully, noting the lines around his eyes and the way he held his shoulders like he was expecting trouble. "What kind of work did you do?" I asked. "Same as you. Maintenance, cleaning, following the rules." He emphasized those last words in a way that made them sound ominous. "You've been following the rules?" "Of course," I said, though my voice came out less certain than I wanted. "Ms. Hunter was very specific about them." Robert's laugh had no humor in it. "Specific. Yeah, that's one word for it." He glanced at the house again, then stepped closer to me, lowering his voice. "Those rules aren't just some rich lady's weird preferences. They're protection against something that lives in that house." The hedge trimmer suddenly felt very heavy in my hands. "What do you mean? Something that lives in the house? You've seen the food, right? Perfect meals just appearing on that dining room table?" When I nodded, Robert continued. "That food isn't meant for the living, it's bait. You eat even one bite and you get marked, tagged for the Shadow Man." My mouth went dry. "The Shadow Man? Lives in the pool during the day, moves through the house at night, hunts anyone who breaks too many rules." Robert's eyes were fixed on mine now, the first time he'd stopped checking the windows since he'd started talking. "You looked at that painting, didn't you? I can tell. That thing's a doorway. Lets him watch from wherever he is, pick his targets." I thought about the man in the portrait, how his expression seemed to change each time I glanced at it, how his hand had appeared to point toward the staircase, like he was directing something. "You're saying the painting is alive?" "Not alive. Connected. To him. To the Shadow Man." Robert wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, a nervous gesture that reminded me of how my hands had been shaking after I'd seen that dark figure by the pool. "You need to quit. Today. Pack up whatever you brought and get out of here before it's too late." "But Miss Hunter collects people who break too many rules," Robert cut me off. "Workers who get curious, who start testing boundaries. She's been doing it for decades. Previous workers just disappear." The woods around us seemed to get quieter, like even the birds had stopped calling. I could feel sweat collecting at the base of my neck despite the shade from the trees. "What happened to them?" Robert's face went pale, and for the first time since he'd started talking, he looked genuinely terrified. He raised one shaking hand and pointed directly at the pool area, visible through the gap between the house and the garage. "What do you mean?" I demanded. "What happened to the other workers?" But when I turned my head to follow his gesture, looking toward the pool area where I'd seen that dark shape moving beneath the water, and then turned back to ask for more details, Robert was gone. Completely gone. I spun around, scanning the entire garden area. No figure walking away through the bushes, no footsteps retreating toward the woods. Nothing. The spot where he'd been standing looked exactly like the rest of the lawn. No flattened grass, no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. "Robert?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I said it. "Where did you go?" Silence. Not even an echo from the trees. I dropped the hedge trimmers and ran to the edge of the woods where I'd first seen him emerge. The undergrowth was thick enough that it would be impossible to move through quickly without making noise, but I pushed through anyway, branches catching at my clothes and scratching my arms. I searched for any sign of passage, broken twigs, disturbed leaves, footprints in the soft earth. Nothing. The woods showed no indication that anyone had walked through them in years. The fallen leaves lay undisturbed in thick layers, and the low-growing plants hadn't been trampled or pushed aside. If Robert had come from this direction, he'd managed to do it without leaving any trace of his presence. I spent 20 minutes combing through the garden and the edge of the woods, checking every possible hiding spot and route of escape. Behind the garage, around the far side of the house, even in the overgrown areas where the landscaping had been completely abandoned. But Robert had vanished as completely as if he'd never existed. Standing in the middle of the garden, breathing hard and feeling increasingly panicked, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. People didn't just disappear. They couldn't. There had to be a logical explanation for where Robert had gone. But as I picked up the hedge trimmers and walked back toward the house, his words kept echoing in my mind. The shadow man, workers who disappeared, the food that was bait and the painting that was a doorway, and the way he'd pointed at the pool when I'd asked what happened to the previous workers. I glanced toward the pool area visible through the gap between buildings, and felt that cold shock of recognition again. The dark shape was there, moving beneath the surface. But this time it seemed closer to the edge, like it had been listening to our conversation. Like it knew I'd been talking to someone who'd tried to warn me. I'd reached my limit. The conversation with Robert, even if he'd vanished into thin air, had confirmed what my gut had been screaming for days. This place was wrong, dangerous, and I needed to get out before something worse happened than pale dead mice and whispered voices behind locked doors. The decision felt like a weight lifting off my chest as I walked back toward the house. No amount of money was worth whatever was hunting people in this mansion. I'd figure out another way to help my family, find a normal job that didn't involve supernatural threats and impossible rules designed to keep me alive. My overnight bag was still upstairs in the small bedroom, but first I wanted to collect my tools from the garage. I'd brought a decent set of wrenches and screwdrivers from home, and I wasn't leaving them behind for Ms. Hunter to dispose of along with whatever happened to her previous workers. The garage felt like the safest space on the entire property. Concrete and metal and normal smells that reminded me of the real world beyond these grounds. I gathered my tools methodically, checking each drawer and shelf to make sure I wasn't forgetting anything. My hands moved with purpose for the first time in days, no longer shaking or hesitating at every sound. As I closed the toolbox and prepared to head back to the house, I heard it, splashing from the direction of the pool, not the gentle lapping of water against pool edges or the mechanical sounds of filtration equipment. This was deliberate movement, like someone swimming or wading through the water with strong, purposeful strokes. The sound carried clearly through the evening air, rhythmic and unmistakable. I set the toolbox down and crept toward the garage's side door, the one that offered a partial view of the pool area. My brain was already working through rational explanations. Maybe Ms. Hunter had returned early and decided to take a swim. Maybe the property did have other maintenance staff I hadn't been told about. Maybe it was just a large piece of pool equipment that had come loose and was floating around. But when I peered around the corner of the garage, every rational explanation evaporated. The shadow man was standing waist-deep in the center of the pool, water rippling outward from where its body met the surface. Not swimming, not floating, but standing upright like the pool bottom was solid ground beneath its feet. Its form was exactly as Robert had described, a human-shaped area of absolute darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Where a normal person's face should be, there was nothing. No features, no expression, just a smooth void that somehow managed to be turned directly toward me. Even from this distance, I could feel its attention like a physical weight pressing against my chest. The water around it looked wrong, too. Instead of the bright blue I'd seen during daylight hours, the area immediately surrounding the shadow man appeared darker, as if its presence was draining color from everything nearby. The pool lights cast their usual glow, but where the beams touched this thing, they seemed to die. I pressed myself back against the garage wall, hoping I hadn't been spotted. But even as I tried to convince myself I was hidden, I knew it was watching me. The same sensation I'd felt while passing the painting in the main hallway, that constant awareness of being observed, but multiplied tenfold. A soft splash drew my attention back to the pool. The shadow man had moved closer to the edge, gliding through the water with movements that looked nothing like normal swimming, Its body flowed rather than stroked, like it was made of liquid darkness that could reshape itself at will. The water didn't seem to slow it down or provide resistance. It moved through the pool as easily as it might move through air. Another few steps, and it would reach the shallow end. I could see the concrete steps leading out of the pool, and the thing was heading directly toward them. I grabbed my toolbox and ran for the house, no longer caring about stealth or trying to appear calm. My work boots slapped against the concrete driveway as I sprinted toward the front door, toolbox banging against my leg with each step. The keys to the house were in my pocket, along with the keys to my car, and my overnight bag was waiting upstairs. I could be packed and driving away in less than 5 minutes. But when I reached the front door and tried my key, it wouldn't turn. The lock that had worked perfectly for days was now completely seized, as if someone had filled the mechanism with glue. I tried pushing harder, jiggling the key, even pulling it out and trying again, but the lock refused to budge. I ran around to the back door, the one that led into the kitchen. Same result. The key slid into the lock but wouldn't turn no matter how much force I applied. Both doors that I'd been using regularly were now sealed shut, locked from the inside by something that had no physical form. Panic started creeping up my throat as I tried every ground floor window I could reach. Each one was secured as tightly as if it had been nailed shut. Windows that had opened easily for evening air checks now refused to move even a fraction of an inch. The latches turned, but the frames themselves seemed frozen in place by some invisible force. I was trapped outside while my belongings and car keys were inside, and somewhere behind me, something inhuman was climbing out of a pool to come hunting. The temperature around the house began dropping noticeably. Not the gradual cooling of evening air, but a sudden, unnatural chill that made my breath visible in small puffs. I could feel the cold radiating from the walls themselves, as if the entire structure was becoming a refrigerator. That's when I realized the Shadow Man was no longer outside. It had somehow entered the house, and its presence was affecting the temperature throughout the building. I could track its movement by following the waves of cold air that seemed to emanate from wherever it went. The chill moved from the back of the house toward the front, pausing at what I estimated was the main hallway where the painting hung. Then it began climbing, growing stronger as whatever was inside made its way up the staircase toward the second floor, toward my overnight bag in the bedroom where I'd been sleeping for the past several nights. I tried every window again, desperate now, pulling and pushing with enough force to leave my palms raw against the glass. The house had become a sealed box, trapping my belongings inside with something that Robert claimed hunted previous workers. Finally, I grabbed a decorative stone from the garden border and hurled it at the kitchen window. The glass spiderwebbed but didn't break completely. I grabbed a larger rock and threw it again, and this time the window exploded inward in a shower of sharp fragments. I didn't care about the noise or the damage. I kicked out the remaining shards around the frame and climbed through, feeling pieces of glass slice through my jacket sleeves and cut across my palms as I hauled myself into the kitchen. Blood from the cuts made my hands slippery, but I ignored the stinging pain and focused on getting to my car keys. The inside of the house felt like a walk-in freezer. My breath came out in thick clouds, and the walls were actually developing a thin layer of frost in some places. Whatever was moving through the second floor was powerful enough to affect the entire building's temperature. I could hear it now. Not footsteps exactly, but something moving across the floors above me with a sound like fabric being dragged across wood, slow and deliberate, checking each room methodically, looking for me. My car keys were on the kitchen counter where I'd left them that morning. I grabbed them and ran for the broken window, no longer concerned about collecting my belongings or tools. The overnight bag could stay upstairs with whatever was searching for it. I had my keys and my life, and that was enough. I climbed back through the window, cutting myself again on glass fragments I'd missed the first time, and sprinted from my car. Behind me, the dragging sound had stopped. The house had gone completely silent, which somehow felt worse than the noises. My Honda started on the first try, and I reversed down the driveway faster than was safe, gravel spraying behind my tires. I didn't stop to look back until I'd reached the main road and put the car in drive. But when I glanced in my rearview mirror, I could see a dark figure standing in the mansion's front doorway, perfectly still, watching my escape with that featureless face turned in my direction. Even from this distance, across the grounds and through the iron gates, I could feel its attention following me. I pressed the accelerator to the floor and drove toward the highway, not slowing down until I saw the lights of normal traffic and normal buildings around me. The radio was playing a pop song I recognized, and the dashboard clock showed it was only 9:30. The ordinary world was still functioning exactly as I'd left it. I drove straight home to my family's apartment, determined never to return to that place again. The next evening, I sat at our small kitchen table picking at leftover Chinese takeout, grateful for the familiar sounds of normal life around me. My little sister Carmen was telling Mom about her day at school, something about a science project on volcanoes, and the conversation felt like the most beautiful thing I'd ever heard. No whispered voices from locked rooms, no mysterious food appearing on tables, no dark shapes moving beneath water. Just my family, safe in our cramped apartment with its leaky faucet and peeling paint around the windows. The walls might be thin enough to hear our neighbors arguing, and the air conditioning might still be broken, but everything here was real and explicable in mine. Mom had managed to scrape together enough for actual groceries after I'd given her $500 for my first day's pay. The relief on her face when I'd handed her the cash made every moment of terror at that mansion feel worth it. We'd have enough for rent this month, maybe even enough to fix the AC before summer really hit. Carmen finished her story about mixing baking soda and vinegar, making explosion sounds with her mouth that made Mom laugh. I found myself relaxing for the first time in days, my shoulders finally dropping from the constant tension I'd been carrying. Whatever was happening at Ms. Hunter's mansion, it was behind me now. I'd quit, I'd escaped, and I was home. "Oh, I almost forgot," Mom said, pushing back from the table with excitement in her voice. "We have dessert tonight. A real treat." She disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying a chocolate cake that made my blood freeze in my veins. The cake was perfect, too perfect. Elaborate chocolate frosting swirled in decorative patterns that formed intricate rosettes around the edges, exactly like the desserts that had appeared on the forbidden dining room table. The same rich dark chocolate, the same professional presentation that looked like it belonged in an expensive restaurant window. But it was the specific details that made my hands start shaking, the way the frosting curved in a particular spiral pattern near the center, the small decorative flourishes at each corner that weren't random but deliberately placed, the exact shade of chocolate that was darker than normal grocery store cakes, but lighter than true baker's chocolate. This wasn't just similar to the mansion cakes, this was identical. "Isn't it beautiful?" Mom said, setting it carefully in the center of our small table. "A very well-dressed elderly woman brought it by this afternoon. Said you'd earned it through your excellent work and she wanted to show her appreciation." The room started spinning around me. I gripped the edge of the table hard enough to hurt my fingers, trying to anchor myself to something solid. What did she look like? Silver hair pulled back very neat, expensive black dress. Such good manners. Mom beamed as she went to get plates from the kitchen. "She said she was so impressed with your dedication and reliability. It's wonderful to see employers who really appreciate good workers." Carmen leaned closer to examine the cake, her eyes wide with the kind of excitement only kids could manage over dessert. "It smells amazing, like the fancy bakery downtown." "Don't touch it," I said, my voice coming out sharp enough to make both of them look at me with surprise. Mom returned with 3 plates and a knife, already reaching toward the cake to cut the first slice. "I thought we could each have a nice big piece. It's been so long since we've had anything this special." "Mom, stop." But she was already pressing the knife through the top layer of frosting, making the first cut with careful precision. I could see how proud she was to offer us something beautiful for once, something that wasn't day-old bread or generic brand, everything bought with food stamps and careful calculation. "James earned this," she said to Carmen while preparing the first slice. "Your brother worked so hard this week." The knife completed the cut, and she lifted a perfect triangle of cake toward her plate. I watched the fork in her other hand rise toward her mouth, and everything Robert had told me crashed back into my memory. The food isn't meant for the living. It's bait. You eat even one bite, and you get marked. I lunged across the table and knocked the plate from her hands. It hit the floor and exploded into pieces, cake and frosting scattering across the linoleum in a dark, sticky mess. "James!" Mom stared at the destruction in shock. "What on earth is wrong with you? You can't eat that." I was breathing hard, my heart racing from the sudden movement and the terror of what had almost happened. "That cake is dangerous. It's connected to the job I just quit." Carmen looked between the destroyed cake and my face, picking up on the fear in my voice even if she didn't understand it. Mom's expression shifted from surprise to concern, then to frustration as she looked at the expensive dessert now splattered across our kitchen floor. "James, that was a gift from your employer. A very expensive gift." She knelt down and started collecting the larger pieces, her movements sharp with irritation. "This woman went out of her way to show appreciation for your work, and she's not normal, Mom. The job wasn't normal. I can't explain everything right now, but that cake..." I gestured at the mess on the floor. "Nothing about that cake is safe." Mom straightened up, holding pieces of broken plate in her hands. "Safe? James, it's chocolate cake from a bakery." I wanted to tell her about the shadow man, about the dark shape that had emerged from the pool to hunt me through a house that wouldn't let me leave, about paintings that changed when you looked at them and rooms that unlocked themselves and mice drained of all color like something had sucked the life out of them. But looking at her face, at the disappointment and confusion there, I knew she'd never believe me. Normal people didn't believe in things that absorbed light instead of reflecting it, in doors that locked themselves, in cake that appeared on tables like bait in a trap. "The woman who brought it," I said instead. "Was she about this tall?" I held my hand up to indicate Ms. Hunter's height. Sharp eyes, kind of intimidating even when she was being polite. Mom nodded slowly. "That sounds right." She had such an elegant way of speaking. "She's my former employer, and I quit for very good reasons." I knelt down to help clean up the cake, careful not to let any of it touch my skin directly. "If she comes back, if anyone delivers anything else from her, don't accept it. Don't let Carmen accept it either. Promise me." Carmen had been watching our conversation with the wide-eyed attention kids develop when adults are having serious discussions they're not supposed to understand. She pointed at the cake pieces I was collecting. "It does smell weird. Not bad, but different." Mom looked at her daughter, then back at me. "James, if this woman is bothering you, we can call the police." "No," I said quickly. "The police couldn't help with something like this. They dealt with normal criminals, normal threats, not with things that emerged from pools to hunt people who broke supernatural rules. Just promise me, if she comes back, don't accept anything from her." The disappointment in Mom's voice was hard to hear. "I'll throw away the rest of the cake. But James, if you're having problems with a former employer, there are proper ways to handle these things." We finished cleaning the kitchen in relative silence. Carmen went to her room to work on homework, and Mom washed the dishes with the kind of focused attention she used when she was processing something she didn't quite understand. I could tell she was replaying the encounter with Ms. Hunter, trying to figure out what she'd missed. I spent the rest of the evening checking the locks on our apartment door and making sure all the windows were secure. Our building wasn't much, but it had decent locks and neighbors close enough to hear if something went wrong. I told myself that Ms. Hunter couldn't reach us here, that whatever supernatural power she commanded was tied to her mansion and couldn't follow me home. But I kept thinking about how easily she'd found our address, how she'd known exactly when to arrive with a cake my mother couldn't refuse. how she'd presented herself as the perfect, grateful employer while delivering something that Robert had warned me was bait for creatures that hunted rule breakers. The next morning, I woke up to find another cake sitting outside our apartment door. This one came with a small card written in Ms. Hunter's sharp handwriting. "Thank you for your ongoing service. Your dedication has not gone unnoticed." It was signed with her name in the same elegant script I'd seen on the note she'd left in the mansion's kitchen. I carried the cake directly to the dumpster behind our building and threw it away without opening the box. But 3 hours later, when I checked the mail, there was a delivery notice saying a package had been left with our building manager. When I went downstairs to collect it, I found another identical cake with another note. "Your family's well-being remains my priority. Please accept this token of appreciation." Same handwriting, same signature, same cake that looked exactly like the ones that had appeared on the forbidden dining room table. I threw the second cake away and spent the rest of the day watching our apartment building's entrance from the window. No delivery trucks came by. No elderly woman in expensive black dresses appeared in the lobby. But somehow, when I checked the hallway outside our door that evening, a third cake was waiting. This one's note was shorter. "Distance is no obstacle. Service continues regardless of location." By the end of the second day, I'd disposed of 5 cakes total. They arrived through different delivery services, sometimes left by the building manager, sometimes appearing outside our door without explanation. Each came with a note that made it clear Ms. Hunter considered me still employed, still under her authority, still subject to whatever twisted arrangement she'd made with the supernatural forces that controlled her mansion. Carmen asked why I kept throwing away cakes, and I told her they were from someone I didn't want to owe favors to. Mom accepted my explanation, but I could see her watching me with growing concern, trying to understand why her normally practical son was destroying expensive desserts. I started checking all the locks obsessively, searching online for additional security measures we could afford. But deep down, I was beginning to understand that locks and distance and physical barriers wouldn't matter. The Shadow Man's influence had followed me home. Ms. Hunter had found a way to mark my family through her gifts, to make them part of whatever game she'd been playing with workers who broke too many rules. I'd thought escaping the mansion meant I was free. But sitting in our small apartment, watching cake after cake arrive with notes that grew more pointed each day, I realized that Ms. Hunter and whatever forces she controlled had claimed me regardless of my attempts to quit. And now my family was part of it too.